Today is the 10th of August 2021. My name is Norbert Meyn and I'm here in West London today with Erika Fox, the composer. Hello, Erika.
Hello, Norbert.
You spent most of the pandemic, which we are hopefully getting to the end of now, in Wales, and I'm pleased you're now back in London so we can speak about your life and about your work as a composer. You just finished a piano concerto for the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra and the pianist Julian Jacobson. And also just before the pandemic, the first major CD of your works was published by the Goldfield Ensemble and has been widely received with great critical acclaim. And your music is available, sheet music is available through the Composer's Edition, and more will become available soon. And also Tetractus Publishing have made some available. So you're now on the map, we could say, as a composer.
And also most of my works are still, as it were, with me. So if anybody wants to look at something and it's not with one of those publishers, then they could get in touch with me. I have it, you know.
So perhaps we can start at the very beginning now and talk about when and where you were born and in what circumstances.
In Vienna, of course, as you said at the beginning. It was not a very good time, of course, because, certainly for Jewish people. And on my birth certificate, there is only my mother's name, because if people were married only according to Jewish law, they were not married. So legally, as it were, my parents were not married. They were, of course, married, but that's how it was.
And that was in 1936?
36, yes.
So the Anschluss in 1938, when Hitler marched into Austria and really it all became one, that was in when you were 2 years old?
That's right, yes, yes.
Could you say a bit more about your family, your parents, and also your grandfather, who of course was a very important person in your life as a rabbi and as a singer as well?
Yes, he was. I used the word singer to you before, but it isn't really singing. I mean, we call it davening, which actually translates as praying. He was a chazan, which is a cantor. We had the synagogue in our house, and it was the same in England, and we always did. And he was the cantor, but also the rabbi. And the word actually in Yiddish is a Rebbe, which is R-E-B-B-E, in English translated, because it wasn't exactly the same as a rabbi is here. Here it's much more kind of formal, and you do exams, and you know you study this. Those people were more like spiritual leaders. They would pray, and those prayers, and I call it singing because it was very expressive. Although the words are read, they knew the words by heart, of course, actually, and it was, to listen to him, it was really a personal, a person addressing God, very personally. It wasn't like a, you know, like a, I don't know, like a cantor in a church, or it was much more personal and very, almost like a family. It was almost like a family in which God was a part somehow.
So your grandfather, had he come to Vienna from Romania, or
He came from Strojenic, which was, I think, in Romania. Things changed, you know, borders of countries changed so much that you know, actually my own father, his language was Hungarian. And he knew some Polish, but I think where he came from is actually Poland now. But anyway, it was Hungarian. He spoke German and Hungarian, and Hebrew, of course, and Yiddish. Yiddish was the language that we used in our home. And that was the first language, I suppose, I heard, yes. Some people don't call it a language, of course. It's really, in a way, it's not a proper language. It's a mixture of all kinds of languages. Partly German, partly Polish, partly Hebrew. There's also, you know, it's a mixture of a language, really.
And your mother, what was her background?
Well, of course, she was the daughter of this rabbi. Yeah. She was, unfortunately, she had a terrible autoimmune disease. She had rheumatoid arthritis. And I don't remember my mother being anything but slightly and then very crippled. I don't know if you've ever seen people with that disease, but they, you know, their hands are twisted, and I mean, she couldn't walk very well. I mean, she was an ill person, and after that she got TB as well, so she was quite a sick woman, but also very, very artistic. She was quite untutored completely. She never had a lesson, but she painted beautifully, and really beautifully. In fact, some of her paintings, there's one over there, which is of my grandfather's glasses, the prayer book, and the tallis, which is like a shawl that Jewish men wear in the synagogue. I'm sure you'll agree, I don't know whether you like art or you love art, but it has an atmosphere that is very much like the one I remember when my grandfather sang, yes.
So the family was very, very closely, you know, embedded in a Hasidic Jewish community in Vienna.
Yes.
Until 1938, and then had to get out.
Well, in 39, my father left in 38, and he went to Palestine by boat, of course. And when the war broke out, he joined the British Army. It was then, Palestine was then a British mandate. But my mother and some of the rest of my family came to Britain. I think you did ask me why Britain, and I couldn't answer because I don't know. We came here, and some uncles and my grandfather, and aunts also. Yes. My grandmother, she was actually a step-grandmother because my grandfather was married twice. And in those days, of course, his first wife died in childbirth. And so he married again. And this particular grandmother, who was the only one I knew, came later. She was in Romania. How she survived, I honestly don't know. She used to tell me terrible stories about men on horseback, soldiers. She told me once that she was up against a wall going to be shot. Why she wasn't shot, I don't even know. I mean, she used to tell me these things, and, you know, I'm sorry to say, as a child, I didn't hear them as well as I should have.
So your grandmother, your grandfather's second wife, came to Britain after the war?
Yes, after the war, yes.
Do you know anything about how your mother and yourself actually travelled?
We travelled by plane, obviously the old planes, and I remember it very well simply because I was sick. I was given one of those horrible paper bags to be sick in, and I was sick the entire journey. And after that, I was afraid to fly, and I'm sorry to say I still am. I do fly, but I am flight phobic, rather. But I don't know if that was the reason, but anyway, it could be.
And then your family found a home in London. And could you tell us about the first years in London?
We stayed, it must have been in the East End, in a sort of home or house, really, for Jewish refugees. It was a temporary shelter or something. And one of my uncles, my Uncle Morris, who was a very extraordinary and wonderful man, actually, he was the only one sort of in the family who was in the world as well. And he spoke some English, and he got a house for us, and he sort of looked after us, really. Always, actually, always. He's been dead a long time now, but he was a very wonderful man, a very generous and fantastic man, really.
And so your grandfather was able to continue his role as a...
Yes, it was almost like, I suppose, when he was in Strojanitz, which of course I wasn't born then, but there were a little kind of group, and then they were transplanted into Vienna, and then they were transplanted into London. And we had this house. It was called Beit Shalom, which in Hebrew means the house of peace. It was called that because my grandfather's name was Shalom, Shalom Hager. And and one of my uncles was also, had studied to be a rabbi, and he also used to sing. And we had a congregation, and they were very, very loyal. They must have known us from Vienna, and they were people, obviously, who must have come to the synagogue in Vienna. And those of them who survived and came to London, they came to our house, and they were there every Friday night, sometimes every morning, certainly on Saturdays. And so, in that community, unfortunately, women have a very subsidiary role. And, well, so I say subsidiary, they run the home, which isn't subsidiary in a way, but they don't have, as it were, direct access to God. So what I remember, and this is why to this day actually, I love men's voices more than women's voices, and particularly deep men's voices. I love the bass voice. Well, I love all voices actually if they're good, but you know, I still hear those voices in my head, and they were a bit special, really.
And your grandfather's voice, was that a bass voice?
It was a rather hoarse voice. When I remember it now, it was a bit, it sounded a bit, I think we've talked about this, it sounded a bit flamenco-like. It seemed to come from here rather than here and here, you know.
We know that he impressed other musicians.
So of course, Joseph Schmidt, who was a very famous tenor,
yes,
and who started, in a way, his career by singing in our synagogue. Yeah.
What was it like for you as a child to grow up in this environment, and also when you entered school, what was that like?
Well, my first forays into English schools, primary schools, were very dreadful. I was a total fish out of water. I was a real foreigner, which was an insulting word at one time for English people. The English just didn't like foreigners, actually, and anybody who wasn't one of them was a foreigner, you know. And children were the same, you know. I was definitely not accepted. But then I was lucky, and I went for piano lessons to an amazing woman. Her name was Millicent Silver. She then became a harpsichordist, and when I met her, she taught piano. And she taught me for some years, completely free. She didn't charge. She wanted to do something for Jewish refugees. They were not Jewish. She got me into a secondary school. It had a headmistress who was an extraordinary woman. Her name was Muriel Potter. And it may be that you could even look her up. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was quite famous in her way.
Were you born in 1936, you would have entered the school at the beginning of the war, sort of 1940-41, I suppose, the first primary school.
The first primary, but during the Blitz, we were evacuated. We went to Leeds. I lived in Leeds in a house also for Jewish refugees. In the main road in the centre of Leeds called Chapeltown Road. And that is where I first started music, in a way, because in that house, it was a huge Victorian house, much bigger than this one, dark and kind of miserable, really. But for a while, we were there alone, my mother and I. And there was, leading to the hall, there was a hatch where, obviously, in the golden days, families who lived there had servants who used to serve meals through the hatch. And so I got a chair and I looked through the hatch. I mean, I was very small, you know. And there was a piano in that room. And I climbed through the hatch and started playing the piano. And that was the best time I remember, because I used to make up pieces, and they always sounded a bit really like Hasidic little melodies, you know, but there were plenty of them. You know, there were 2 or 3 a day I used to go through. My poor mother, I gave her the most terrible time, because I used to say, you're not allowed to go to sleep because you've got to remember this tune. And I would sing it and she would sing it. And of course she slept, and in the morning she'd forgotten and I was annoyed. But anyway, it was the start. It was a good start. I mean, I'm not saying it was a happy time, but certainly it was a time for me when I did escape into that room, and it was fine. You know.
And then after your evacuation from Leeds finished, you came back to London, and then the secondary school you mentioned. And was there any other musical training in your school years that we could mention?
In secondary school, I never thought of it at the time. It's funny, you ask me questions, and then I remember the things, you know, I didn't think of them before. I mean, I did do music O-level and things, but I was probably the only kind of musician in the school, because I remember being asked to play for assembly every morning. I used to play when the girls came into the assembly, and occasionally I played something that I made up, you know. Yes, I mean, so I never, you know, when you're a certain age, you're not self-conscious. You get self-conscious later. So it was quite normal. I said, play it for assembly, and I played for assembly. You know.
So you had your first audience right there. And then what happened after you finished school? Where did you go next?
I went to the Royal College of Music. I had gone before. I went earlier. I went once a week to the junior department. There again, it was to do with that piano teacher. She sent me to play to 2 people. I remember one of them was called Sir Percy Buck. I don't know who he was, but obviously he was an important chap, being a sir, and a woman who ran the junior department. And I couldn't really play, but I just played my own pieces, you know. And they said I could come. And so I did have lessons. And then an amazing thing happened. I had piano lessons there. The person who ran the place, Angela Bull was her name, just remember. And she said, would you like, can we get someone else in for you? Would you like to learn something else? And I said, yes, I'd like to do composition. And they actually hired a young man. Philip Cannon was his name, an English composer, very, very English. I say that because there could never have been a greater contrast between his music and my music. We didn't have anything in common. And in fact, I wasn't very good at harmony exercises. And when there was a false relation in my harmony exercise, he would look at it and say, you've got a mother-in-law here. Anyway, so that was Philip Cannon. Yes, so, you know, I was a juniors, and then I went to the Royal College.
You would have finished school in the late 40s or in the early 50s?
When I went to, as a proper student to college, was in September 54.
You learned composition and piano?
I had a piano scholarship, actually, and I studied with a pianist called Angus Morrison. He was a very fine pianist, not at all a good teacher for me, a lovely man and a very fine pianist, but I needed kind of more. I wasn't good at sight reading. I mean, he taught interpretation, but I really needed a practical approach, you know, to learn. Interpretation, I thought I didn't need. I needed the nuts and bolts, you know. But still, I studied with him, and then composition with a composer called Bernard Stevens. I mean, you're working at college, you probably will have come across Bernard Stevens' name, but he was as famous at the time for being a communist as he was for being a composer. And yes, he was a very staunch communist. And then in 1956, he left because of the Hungarian uprising, and he left the party. I remember him telling me, I went for a lesson, and he didn't say good morning or anything. He looked so sad, and the first thing he said to me, I've left the party. Just like that. Anyway, he was a very nice man. Again, not for me, but that could have been simply because, in a way, I wasn't ready. But in another way, for instance, we once went to the pub, he and I and another student, a young man, and I remember Bernard saying to this young man, of course it's different for Erika. She can't go into the pub and meet people like us because I was a woman and it just wasn't on, you know.
So what was life like at college in the 1950s? And, you know, especially, you were mentioned, you know, as a female student, that I suppose you were in a minority?
I was not in a minority, but it's hard to believe now, it really is. But very few of the young women expected to have a career. They went to college like a sort of finishing school, you know. You'd go to college and then you'd get married, and that was the end of it. I'm sure that not everybody was like that, but I didn't have friends really there, except one who is still my very close friend. I met him, I think I mentioned, the first day I was there. He came up to me and he said, "You're Erika, and we've both got scholarships, so we've got to be friends." And we're friends to this day. You may have heard of him. His name is John Tilbury, and he's a very famous pianist, but he specializes and always has in Morton Feldman and John Cage and that sort of music, you know. He studied in Poland, actually, and he's a very fine pianist, but he really only plays that music.
Now, you were living in this Hasidic community in London, and you were going to the Royal College of Music. How did you feel supported by your family to pursue a career as a musician?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I have to answer no and yes. In a way, I don't know how to put it really. They were probably quite proud of the fact that I played the piano and things, you know. But at the same time, they fully expected me to be a housewife and nothing else. And that was a fact. That's how it felt. It felt as though the music was not real. It was like it was a little hobby or an entertainment or something. It wasn't. Real life was here and music was here.
When did you finish at the Royal College, and what happened then?
I stopped going to the college in 1958. Kind of nothing happened. I remember going to an agency trying to find a job, where I never found a job, and then I started playing for ballet. I used to play for different ballet classes and different groups and schools and this and that. I also played for a woman who ran a ballet school for upper class children. And so they were not serious either. They were dressed up to the nines, and we went to kind of smart country houses for the upper classes. And I had to go through the servants' entrance, and because that's how it was with the English upper classes. If you did a job of any kind, you were a servant, you know. It didn't bother me. I never minded it. I thought it was silly somehow. I thought it was funny. Yes, I mean, it didn't impinge on my life really. But I did that. And I also had a little pupil who was she was the daughter of Lord Waller, and her name was Zeli, and I taught her piano. And it was perfectly obvious that they didn't treat her lessons seriously either. It was something you had to do. But I remember being very strict with her, and she got a distinction for one of her exams because I made her practice. And I remember getting a letter to say thank you for that, which I was very happy with as well. So anyway, I did that for a while. Then I got a job in a school. I was never qualified as a teacher except for piano. I got an ARCM for piano teaching, but I wasn't qualified as a class teacher. But again, at that time, things were very different. You had an interview with somebody who knew a few things and who had influence, and I can't remember his name, but this was in Tottenham, and he gave me a job as a class music teacher. I have to say, I did very badly. It was just not for me. I didn't know how to keep order. It was like bedlam in the class. It was wartime. in the class. Everybody was screaming and shouting. I couldn't shut them up. And then I got a job in another school in Finchley, which was only for girls, and you would have thought that it would be easier, but no, it was not at all easier. Actually, the first school, which was called Markfield Secondary Modern School, in those days there were secondary modern schools, grammar schools, that changed many years later, but this was a secondary modern school. So there were some okay kids, but others were, you know, little criminals, really. They just, absolutely impossible. But also, the headmaster there, he was a misogynist. He hated women. He really hated women. And there's proof of that, because he was head of a body called the Association of School Masters. He was obviously decided women were not teachers, you know. I mean, he was like that. And also, he knew that I wasn't good at sight reading. And I used to practice the hymn in the morning. Every day I practiced the hymn for the next morning. But when I got to the piano, he would change the hymn on purpose, you know, to make it difficult for me. But anyway, so one good thing happened in that school. I had a choir. They were very good. I managed with that choir. And one other thing happened. The BBC came to film. There was a teacher who taught drama. And in that sort of school, nobody liked academic subjects. They just didn't turn up or whatever. But they liked drama. And they used to come after school. They loved it. And she actually was quite a famous educator. And she went to Hungary to study. And so I wrote the music for one of the dramas that was actually filmed. Of course, you know, none of it's there anymore. We're talking about, when are we talking about, 1960 or something, you know.
How did you continue to write music after you finished your studies, and where did that go?
The short answer is no. I did write that music for the play at that school, but I didn't actually write it down. I improvised, because it was an improvised show. And I was quite good at that at the time. That was like that with playing for ballet. I would look at people and I would play, and I enjoyed that. That was very nice. And so, yes, so I didn't think of it as a composition somehow, but it was really, I suppose. But I didn't then. I didn't do anything for a long time, and I got married, and I had both my children. My daughter was quite ill. She had something wrong with her kidneys. She was in hospital a great deal, and it was a terrible worry. And I had my son, who is 2 years younger. And then, that's interesting, because you've interviewed Michael Graubart, haven't you? Well, I met Michael some years. I was still at college. We had a mutual friend. Her name was Ilona Halberstadt. And then I didn't see Michael for years, you know. I went to a concert at the, I think it was the Vienna. There was a concert.
So Michael Graubart, I mean, just to mention, he was also a child of refugees, and he came, you know, a few years older than you, I think, but he also came at a similar time.
So anyway, he came up to me and, you know, haven't seen you for a long time, and what are you doing, the way you say. And I started crying, I just like that. I didn't know why. And I said to him, I'm not doing anything. And he said, well, I'm at Morley College, and there's a man there that I think you would like, and I think you'd get on. and he teaches composition. He has a class, and his name's Jeremy Dale Roberts.
Jeremy Dale Roberts, yeah.
And so I owe Michael more than I can ever say, actually. I have told him this from time to time. And so then I had started a piece. It was based on some poems by Konstantin Cavafy. So Michael said, why don't you come along to Morley and meet Jeremy and see how you get on? So I went, and Jeremy, who was the most wonderful teacher and composer too, but he was very, some people didn't like him because he was very hard, very strict. He wouldn't suffer fools, you know. And he said, and I brought some things I'd written at college, the whole thing. And he didn't even look at them. He said, I don't want to see that. I want to see something new. Come along in September and bring something new. So I started writing those songs. I went on writing those songs, and I brought them along, and I joined his class. It was the first time, really, that anyone had looked at something that I wrote and took it seriously. And I finished that set of songs, and Jeremy came to the concert. They were played at the Purcell Room. They were sung, Jane Manning sang. And I know that he liked them because there was no doubt about it. I remember him saying, these are absolutely inspired. And they were inspired, you know. What were they inspired by? The poetry. It was wonderful poetry. It is. Well, he's a wonderful poet. I don't know if you know his work, but if you don't, you should.
For how many years did you go to Jeremy's class at Morley College?
Maybe a year or so, but then he left as well, and I said, can I come and have a few lessons with you privately? And at that time he was living in London. He left London with his wife, and they moved to Sussex, and so I never had more lessons with Jeremy, but everything I wrote after that, almost everything, I showed him. And I remember the day extremely vividly when I grew out of Jeremy. I mean, I didn't really ever, you know, to this day I think he was a great man and a wonderful composer. But when I say grew out of, there was a piece he looked at and he said, I don't like it, it's showy. And at first I was terribly hurt, and then I thought, so what? He doesn't have to like it. And it was like I suddenly grew up, you know. It was called Sheer, and it's still one of my better pieces. And in fact, he changed his mind afterwards. It was played at the Brighton Festival, and he said, I've changed my mind. It's not showy. It's all right, you know. But I didn't mind anymore.
You must have kept connections with other musicians, and you must have been able to get some support as a composer. How was that?
In the little spare time I had, which was basically no spare time, I used to run around showing music to people. I remember when I had a few lessons from Harry Birtwistle, one of the first things he ever said to me, you know what, Erika, you must know one thing. There is no front door. Now, it's true. Absolutely. But I didn't know a back door either. And it's very difficult to know, you know. People have asked me many, many times. I did meet people, and sometimes people asked me for music. And music was sometimes played and sometimes broadcast. I mean, in the kind of 70s, 80s, and early 90s, a whole list of my works were performed, but somehow it never led to anything. I remember that piece I was telling you about in the Purcell room. We were 4 composers. There was the Indian composer, my friend Naresh Soul, that I've told you about, and 2 others, I can't remember their names, I'm afraid, and me. So we were 4. 3 of them were men. I had an incredibly good review. It was the best review. But all 3, it led to a sort of career, but not for me. It was just a one-off. And then another piece, a one-off. And that, you remember, you laughed about that the other day because I said, but it was like that. It was like, you know, every single time anything happened, it was a one-off. Even though there were lots of things, you know what I mean? So when I met Kate, for instance, and she said...
You met Kate Romano.
Yeah, and Carla Reese, who came to interview me once, because she has tetractis, but she's also a flautist, and both of them said, well, you were famous once. I was never, ever famous, never. But they thought I was because I had these pieces played, and because I knew people like Birtwistle and Peter Maxwell Davis. I knew them very well. You know, we were really almost contemporaries, you know. I went to Dartington. Max used to be quite nice about my work. He was, and Harry certainly was.
There was the Society for the Promotion of New Music.
I did send things in to them, and 1 or 2 were played. And I sent things into the BBC, you know. I remember sending a piece that was recently broadcast into the BBC, because you could send, you know, and they would look at it, and sometimes they'd play. And I got it back by return of post. And in later years, I was having a chat with David Lumsden, who's Nicola's husband. He's a very good composer himself, Australian. But I knew he was on the panel. I hadn't known at the time, but afterwards, and we were friends. I mean, Nicola and I are very good friends, and I'm very fond of David. But I said, you were on the panel and you never looked at my piece. Yes, we did. I looked at your piece, but it was, you know, and he showed me bits, and it was unplayable. Well, it was not unplayable because it was played on a number of occasions, including recently. It's had, you know, very good reviews, been broadcast again. So it's also true that people used to think my music was too difficult to play. And that may be one reason. There may be many reasons. I think that one reason is because I was a woman. Another reason is because my music is very un-English, very, very un-English, at a time when before there was a kind of explosion of, you know, William Gluck came and people came, Hans Keller, and changed a lot in this country. But it was very parochial before, and unfortunately it's getting parochial again. But it was. And then, and so maybe in later years, because I've had this happen to me many times, people have thought, oh God, what's this, you know. And when they learn it, it's easy. It's not difficult at all. You just got to, you just got to look at something and not expect something else. And people do expect things when they listen, of course, because we're not used to hearing something new. We're not used to looking at something new. And I suppose it's human nature. Maybe it's easy to be comfortable, but music shouldn't be comfortable. It should challenge.
So your music was really quite unlike much other music that was around at the time. And did it have any other influences you could credit? Any other composers that you feel really influenced you apart from Jeremy and your teachers?
I don't think so. Well, when I sort of started again, as it were, I thought, right, now I've got to write 12-note music. And that piece for called 8 Songs from Cavafy is takes a note row and doesn't deviate. It goes all the way along, I think, except the last song a bit, but it was very strictly written. But, you know, funnily enough, looking at it now, listening to it now, it still isn't like anything else. It's still, even though it used only those 12 notes, repeated over and over again, what makes it, I think, different is because it's written for ensemble and voice, and it's really one line, but everybody does things at a different time. But it's really, what makes it different perhaps is the rhythm. It is rhythmically still my music. It's even though I tried, and it was the first and last time I did it, but I still stand by that piece. It's still mine, you know. It's okay.
In 1990, you accompanied John Cage to Paris and Strasbourg.
Yes.
And took part in his Europeras commissioned by the Almeida Festival. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it happened because at that time I had written a piece called The Bet. The libretto was written, well, the dialogue, but not dialogue really, what's the word I want for somebody, narrator, the narration was written by Elaine Feinstein, and it was played at the Almeida Theatre, but it was also, and still is, probably, the only piece which ever earned enough for me to feed the cat, you know.
It was a puppet opera, I believe.
A puppet opera. I called it a puppet theatre piece. It's a sort of opera, yes. And it was very successful. It had amazing write-ups, really, amazing ones. And it was then taken on a tour of schools, not with live players, but recorded. And it was done, I think, in over 100 schools. And it was not really for children as such, but it could have been for children, and it was written, it was played in those schools and done very well. And all of a sudden, one or two people had heard of me, and a man who, I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, he was French, and at that time he was director of the Almeida Theatre. And he was arranging this trip for John Cage. And those your operas, it was a very interesting thing. John Cage said, you've been sending us your operas for hundreds of years, and now I'm going to send them back. And he wrote this piece. Well, it was a sort of, I don't know if you'd call it written even, but there were a lot of gramophones, old ones, and old LPs and sometimes even the older ones, you know, that you had to wind up on. And a few people, and then two pianists and various singers, and it was all done. You had to watch a timer, and at a certain point, people put on a gramophone, and there would be a bit of an aria, famous, La Donna Immobile, and that sort of thing. And then you took it off at a certain point, nothing ever finished, and then the singers would come, and they would sing an aria, you know. And then the pianists would play very contemporary John Cage-like music, you know. It was a collage of some kind, but very effective. So effective. I mean, I couldn't believe this at the time, but a few people told me once or twice it brought tears to my eyes, and other people said the same. Men, in fact. Howard Skempton was in it, and few people. I don't know why. It was the whole idea of it. There was just a glimpse of this and a glimpse of that, and somehow they were very moving. It were like, you know, like you hear things from a distance, and then they've disappeared, and that was the past, and this is the present, and it's come together. It was amazing. And then there was the second opera. That was the first, your opera, and the second one was just one gramophone with one of those horns, you know, and I was doing that one, and it was very soft and not much. It was like an echo of the first one, and he had this idea. Of course, it was wonderful. But because I had been very successful with the bet, they asked me to be one of the composers who was doing the gramophone. You know. And interestingly, at that time, I had a sort of manager for a short time, Eleanor Kelly, and I couldn't ever stand up for myself. But at the last minute, Pierre Audi was his name, the guy from the Almeida. At the last minute, Pierre Audi said, "Oh no, Erika's not coming on this. We've asked another composer." And Eleanor phoned up Pierre Audi and said, "This will not do. You've asked Erika, and you've committed yourself." And so he said, "Okay." So it was. I could never have done it, but she did it. And so I went with them, and I'm so pleased. We had a wonderful time, and I met John Cage, who was the most delightful man, a sweet man, really nice. And I was so happy because he died not long after. He didn't make old bones. He was rather frail somehow. He seemed very frail and delicate somehow. Anyway, so that was a lovely time, yes.
And could you mention any other pieces that did get some circulation from that time?
I wrote another opera, a chamber opera. It was called The Dancer Hotoke. And it was nominated, in fact, for an Olivier Award. I've got it framed upstairs with a picture of Laurence Olivier. Wonderful. And the libretto for that was written by Ruth Fainlight, who was Alan Silito's wife, a very, very fine poet, wonderful poet. You see, I think I mentioned once, because if I had had a proper career, it would have been in opera, I think. I've always, you know, all my life, I've been a theatre goer, Not so much now because I can't hear well enough. But I used to go to theatre much more than to concerts. I used to go a lot. And I used to, as a child even, I used to read plays rather than, I loved reading plays, and I loved drama, and I liked ritual, and I would have written opera as my main life, really. I never had the chance to do that, but I did do that little thing. So I wrote The Dancer Hotoke, based on a Japanese no play. The Japanese no theatre once came to this country. After that, kabuki came, but when the no theatre came, I went 3 times. I mean, I was completely hooked on it, even though it took 4 or 5 hours, you know. I don't know if you've seen no plays, but they are amazing. I mean, you know, you just, the movement is so slow. It's like a slow motion film or something. And you get into that time scale, and it's not realistic. People don't kill each other on stage. They just tell you it happened, you know. It is just so incredible and wonderful. Anyway, this was a very interesting story and a very dramatic one. And so I did do that, and that was a commission. There was a move to commission very short operas, half an hour each, little chamber operas, obviously, to be done at the Riverside Studios, and I was one of the people they asked, you know. To be honest, I never knew why some people would ask me for things, and other people had never heard of me or anything, you know. So it was very singular somehow. I was never what they called in the scene, ever, in any scene at all, actually. But individual people would like my work. It's always been like that. And the first one that ever really, really liked my work was Jeremy. And because he was such unknowledgeable and erudite and really, you know, eminent person, it encouraged me. Yes. And, you know, there is a time when we all need encouragement. We need some feedback. Everybody does. And if you never have any, you don't know where you are. There are very few people are so arrogant they think they're God, even though there's nobody to tell them. But and especially as a woman, you never think that. And so I was very lucky that some people whom I think highly of did like my work. And Nicola Lefanu is one of them. I think she still does, and so does Gillian Whitehead. In her youth, Nicola never did like my work, but she changed her mind, you know. Yes, that's how it was.
Now, in terms of identity, I mean, would you consider yourself a British composer, or how would you respond if somebody called you a British composer?
Well, it's not an insult. You know, and if they call me a British composer, then they mean that I live in this country and I'm British by nationality. I mean, I'll never be English because you're only English if you're born here. So my son and daughter are English, but I'm only British. So that's what they mean. If they say I'm a British composer, meaning my work sounds British, they haven't heard it, or they've got no ears to hear. I mean, because it is absolutely not, you know.
would one differentiate music that is more typically British and music that isn't?
Well, it's very hard to put your finger on it, isn't it? I mean, it's not so hard if you listen, because, you know, when I was saying to you about Philip Cannon, for instance, he could not, if you heard, you know, 10 bars, it would have to be English. It has to be English. The only composer that I know now who is, no, is not the only one, but I mean, Harry's music, I would say, is not typically English. But, you know, a lot of composers still write music that you can hear is English.
Do you think that people would have seen you as an outsider?
Yes. Yes, always.
Why would that be? I mean, you've spent most of your life in this country.
That's a very good question. And you know, people have said to me, oh, I thought you weren't English because you've got an accent. Well, if I've got an accent, I don't know where it comes from, because English is my only home language. I mean, even, you know, I understand a lot of German, but I don't speak fluent German anymore. I speak a little French, but only a little. I mean, English is my language. And I don't know where they've got the idea that I've got an accent. And it always annoys me when people say that, because I said, well, how can I have an accent? I was only 2 3/4 when I came here. I never learnt another language properly, you know. So I don't know why people have always said that to me. And it used to bother me, actually. I don't mean the accent now, I mean the idea that I wasn't kind of one of them. But it doesn't bother me now. I mean, as I said to you once before, the other day, I have been very grateful to this country, always. I'm much more patriotic than many English people, because they saved my life, and without this country I would be a bar of soap or something, you know. So I owe Britain everything, and that's fine. I'm just sorry things have changed here very badly, I think, lately, in the last few years. Somehow a lot of the spirit in this country seems to have changed for the worse. But not everything, because in the 50s, for instance, you know, if you were black, you couldn't find a room. On the window it would say no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. And, you know, that has gone, and thank God it has.
And the other thing that has changed, and you've pointed this out to me, is that I think you said people have seem to have discovered that women are also people.
Because all this has happened to me very recently, out of the blue somehow, I can see around me a lot of women kind of coming to the fore. You know, in The Guardian you see writers, out of all proportion, they're women, or they're black, or they're brown, you know. So suddenly it has become a thing that, you know, we were not fair to these people before, and now we're fair to them, and they'll do this and that, you know. And so I take it all with a very big pinch of salt, because I'm sorry to say that I don't think it will last. I think, you know, fairly soon, or if, maybe not so soon, but soon-ish, that fashion will die out, and women will perhaps again take on not quite as bad a role as they had before, but not in the foreground that they are now. I think it's one of those flash in the pans, you know, and it happened before I die, you know. That's how I feel about it. I think it's one of those things, you know. And so all of a sudden, oh, we never noticed Erika before. She writes music, she's a refugee, this and that and the other. So what? It happened. I was the same yesterday, but only today. Somebody's noticed. Well, I mean, put it this way. In the 90s, 80s, 70s, when I was having some pieces played and some of them were very successful, you wouldn't be here with me talking now. You're only here because I've come to your attention, and it takes an effort to bring people to people's attention. And usually when they don't want to, they don't do it. And if it becomes fashionable, well, they do it for a while, you know. That's how I feel about it. I may be wrong, and it would be nice if I were wrong, but I don't think I am.
So I'm really pleased that, from what you've told me, that you've had regular, since the 1960s, really regular space in your life to write music. And I'm just wondering, when was the time when you felt most free to write music?
Well, I never felt free, but I felt I had to. Now I feel much more free. And it's wonderful, but at the same time, not so good, because somehow you've got to feel, if you don't fill this minute, you'll never have another chance. The door will close. But if the door is always open, you think, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, you know. So that's why it's taken me a year to finish this piece. It would have normally, it would have only taken me, I don't know, 3 months, say.
Yeah. So while you were looking after your children and, you know, with your husband and being in the family, then these hours were very precious, and you had to make them count.
Always a pressure. Yeah. And in fact, interestingly, Jeremy once or twice was jealous of that. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, I couldn't believe that he could be jealous of me for something. But he once said that, because I used to, once, for instance, I wrote a big orchestral piece. It's never been played, but I've got it anyway.
What's it called?
It's called Cocytus, for the river of death, you know. Anyway, I wrote that, the skeleton of it, in approximately 4 days or something, because I used to go occasionally, when I could get away for a day or two. There was a place called the Rural Music Schools Association. I think it doesn't exist now. It was a building in Hitchin in Hertfordshire, and it was for conferences for teachers, or, you know, school teachers. But just, I suppose, to make a bit of money, they would let out a room every now and then for very little money if you wanted to go, and I would go. And I only had these 4 days or whatever, and so I just went, you know, sat down, and didn't do anything else. Sometimes I wouldn't even eat; I'd forget, you know. And he said, "Look, you wrote that in that time." Well, I didn't have any other time. Well, I don't know how you can do that. And so, yes, it's amazing what we can do as human beings when we have to.
So the need is there and then it comes out in that time that is there for it, yes.
Yes.
What strikes me about your music is listening to the chamber music on that beautiful CD, how the individual instruments come out in their characteristics so wonderfully, and And I'm just wondering, you already said they have to feel as if they are all singing their part. That really relates back to, the sort of prayer-like singing that you experienced as a child. When this comes to your, into the bigger orchestral spheres and all that, does that remain the same? And, where does that, how does that really feature in the bigger orchestral music?
Well, I haven't got much big orchestral music. I've never been commissioned an orchestral work. This is the first time in all my life. I wrote this orchestral piece, I said in 4 days or something, because I wanted to. It was after my mother died, and I was very close to my mother, and it hit me terribly badly when she died. In fact, on the front page of that piece, you can still see, like water, and her face. I used to draw it when she'd already died, and it was like there. But so I wrote that piece. The only other bigger forces piece I wrote for 36 players was the one that was broadcast recently, but it was recorded in January 2020, but it was only broadcast a few weeks ago. I don't know if you heard it, but it was. And so that piece definitely uses the same technique. All 36 players, that's why I had to have them in a different position. And it was going to be a problem, but I insisted on it, and they did it, and it worked. I mean, every violin was distanced long before long before it was necessary, all round, and every player was in a different position so that you could hear them individually. And I've been told, for instance, a friend of mine said, when did you arrange this for orchestra? I said, I didn't arrange it. That's how I wrote it. It's for 36 players. But he thought it was for many more players.
What's the title of the piece, and who recorded it?
The title is Ozen Shomat, which comes from the Bible, Ecclesiastes. It just means the hearing ear. And yes, so this big orchestral piece is not even big. It's not for huge forces, but for the BBC Scottish, is actually the first time I was ever commissioned an orchestral piece. So yes, and that has also got solo lines a lot. Not everything, but yes, quite a lot. I mean, it consists of really solo lines that are, I think of as sung, and rhythmic kind of impetus, or also in those prayer things, there's a cantor and there are responses. Now the responses are always in heterophony. They're never together. People do their own thing. So it's always like, this. And that's how I think of it. Yeah. Yes, even now.
Let's talk a bit about some other music you like. What other styles of music do you enjoy?
Well, I was a bit of a late developer, actually. My childhood love, and still is Chopin. I always loved music from more the Russian side. So, I liked music that when I was young, it was fashionable that you must not like that. And Tchaikovsky was among them, and Rachmaninoff was among them, and so on, Mussorgsky. And I came late to certain classical music. For instance, I've always loved Verdi, always. That's one of my great loves. And I came to Mozart operas after Verdi. Verdi was like the first, and then came others. And I came very late to Beethoven. Even when I was 40 maybe, Beethoven wouldn't be one that I would say, you know, before I die, I've got to listen to this. Now I've changed completely. I mean, you know, I love his music now, and so really a lot of my loves came late in life. Bach I always loved. Early music came very late, I mean very early music. And I have to admit that apart from Harry's music, which I absolutely love, and which
Birtwistle.
and I think he's up there, one of the first division, world, I mean, in the world. I've actually not really liked English music. I've never really liked English music very much at all. Even Elgar, a few things, but, you know, he's not a great love of mine, although I do love the cello concerto, a few things, but no, it's not kind of for me. And people like Vaughan Williams, I just have no affinity at all. I've tried many times because, of course, friends of mine, you know, revere him. And when I was even at college, I remember once being at a concert at the Wigmore Hall, and all of a sudden everybody stood up, and I thought, has the Queen come in or something? And it was Vaughan Williams. So, you know, he is revered in this country, I know, but not for me, you know. But actually now I love a lot of music now that I didn't love before, a lot. I love Brahms. You know, and I don't know what to say really. I can't think of anything that I really dislike in music, other than, and you know, even English music is not my love, but you know, it's all right. I wouldn't go to a concert, especially if it was all Vaughan Williams, and I would go to a concert if it was all Chopin.
This early desire of yours to belong and fit in, then also, you say, really changed, and you know, now you think it's actually not a bad thing to not fit in and belong. But do you think that what's the conclusion of that for you? Is it important actually to belong somewhere?
Probably it is. I would like to think it's not, because it would be nice to think that an individual is an individual. And of course that is true of one's friends, you know, I mean, in a way it's a very instinctive thing. You meet somebody and you either like them or you don't, and you're never sure why, really. A bit like a dog, wag wag, or, you know, we were saying the other day. But I think it is important. I think the idea of belonging is a very primeval need for human beings. You belong to a family, you belong to a tribe, and I suppose because we're probably, I mean, we're not loners like cats. We're more like dogs. We need a pack, I suppose. And maybe that's why we fight. You know, I mean, it's men that usually fight, but who knows? If women were on top, they might fight too. I mean, I don't know. But the idea that you're alone is quite frightening.
But yet it also gives you certain freedom that if you firmly belong somewhere.
Exactly. And this is the reason probably that so many Jewish people who have left the religion have gone into the arts or the sciences, or have become quite important in their field, because there was a constraint before and they've broken free, but they had they had the comfort before of belonging. And I think you probably need both. Everybody needs both. Some people need more belonging than others. My daughter, for instance, is kind of okay alone. She lives alone, but I mean, when she was 3, I remember I took her to nursery school for the first time, and we got to the door, and she looked up at me and she said, "You can go now." And my son is the exact opposite. I used to say, when he was 3, I used to say, "Play with your toys a bit. Mum is just going in to cook something or something." I went in. 1 minute late, not even a minute later, he came in. "What shall I do now?" You know, so people are so different from birth, you know. So I've always been okay alone, but wanted to know that somebody cares about me. We all need that, of course. And the people you belong to, they, you know, you think they care about you. Yes, I mean, that's how it is. And that's why when you're a child, if you're very much an outsider and bullied or pushed away, you feel terrible. There couldn't be anything worse, you know. I think it's quite a mature thing to feel you're okay without anything, you know. Yes, I mean.
So now we have all this music that you've written throughout your life, and there is your very individual voice in that, and you've been given an Ivor Novello Award for your lifetime achievement, and there is real value in that people have recognized, and so that voice we will be able to hear to that, to listen to that voice for many, many years to come.
Well, that's very nice of you to say so, and it would be very nice, of course. It would be lovely. I mean, I doubt I'll be here, of course. You know, you know, nobody knows how long they'll live, and I'm already very old. So it could be played or it could not be played. Well, you know, I shall not know.
What are your wishes for the future? What would you like to see in the next years, and what would you like to do?
Well, I feel, I have to admit this, very tired at the moment. Not terribly well, very tired. I think it's probably partly the pandemic, and it's affected everybody, and somehow one doesn't feel safe, and one feels that it's out there, you know, going to get you. So I am tired. If you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have still said I would still love to write those operas that were in my mind before and that I had planned. Because the one that was particularly standing out for me, which I did mention, I think, in the email, was about Herod Agrippa. I very much wanted to write that because it seems to illustrate something that's very much part of me. I'm an ambivalent person. One moment it could be this, and another moment it could be that. I don't mean morally. I mean, I don't say, I could kill somebody or not, but I mean in a different way. And that's the most amazing story, because he planned a coup, and to the last detail, and people were, going to this signal, this was going to happen, and that, and the signals happened, and he changed his mind, and of course he was killed. I mean, he was taken away and killed and so on. But I thought it was so interesting because there is no explanation why he changed his mind. You can take it whichever way you like. And I find that very fascinating and interesting, because people are so extraordinary, aren't they? You think a certain thing about a person and then you're wrong. completely. And the same applies to oneself. I think, why did I do this or that? Today I would be quite different. Or yesterday I did this, today, you know. And you don't always know why you behave a certain way. And I find that very interesting indeed. Yes, there was a Belgian composer called Henri Pousseur, who was quite popular, I think, in probably the 70s. He wrote an opera called Votre Faust, where the audience had the chance to choose one of three endings, you know. You'd say, well, do you want this, and so on. And it would be, each would be okay, you know. And in fact, Harry's work is often like that. But even the first opera, I mean, even the Orpheus, you know, it is such an extraordinary story. He goes there, and then he looks back, and she's gone. But it's just a moment in time, and your whole life changes. It's very fascinating. And a lot of his music's like that. It could be this and it could be that, you know. It's not set. And in fact, the piece I've written now, you know, I looked at it the other day again, and I thought, well, that could have been different, or this, you know, it was just a whim at the moment. And that is, I think, one of the most extraordinary things about people, because I don't think it's true of other animals. They tend to behave in a predictable way, you know. If they're hungry, they hunt, or, you know, whatever it is. But people, they can choose, or sometimes the choices seem to not be one's own, they just happen. And that, I find that very fascinating thing.
So it's been fascinating for me to hear these thoughts and these stories, and we could continue this conversation for a long time. Is there anything else you might want to add to this conversation today, to this interview, before we finish?
It's been lovely for me too. I mean, it's been really, really nice to meet you. I've been very happy to meet you, and, you know, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that a lot of the things we've talked about, we've got quite a lot in common, you and I. You know, we think about a lot of things that we both think about, you know, separately. I mean, and that is lovely. I mean, one of the nicest things for me in my work and in my life, of course, has been meeting wonderful people. I've been very lucky. I have made friends with and met some absolutely marvelous people in my life, and some people who you might think that there wasn't anything special about them, but when you get to know somebody, they're often very much more special than you thought. People are very interesting, and people are so individual. I mean, I don't, in the same way as I write in lines, people are not, having said I'd like to belong, nevertheless, people are not in groups. They're very singular, everybody. And that's the best and most exciting thing in life, isn't it? That just meeting people that you don't know, and then you've met them, and they're marvelous, you know. Yeah. So I don't want to say anything else, really.
Thank you very much, Erika. It's been a huge pleasure to talk to you today.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you, indeed.